Thank you. First of all, I just want to thank everyone for coming to this meeting for the Piedmont DSA Raleigh branch. You guys have been enjoying our music, and I want to say I've been excited about today for a while since we started playing this because we have such great speakers coming. Our first speaker is Octavia Rainey, a well-known and longtime community activist right here in Raleigh, whose radio show Straight Talk at St. Aug, and whose leadership on the North Central Citizens Advisory Council have been and continue to be a source of inspiration for anyone fighting for social change. She is the best of this, and we are honored to have her here today. We're also going to hear from Peter Gilbert, a legal aid attorney in Durham who has been working with the UNC Center for Civil Liberties on issues related to political and environmental justice for historically excluded communities, and also a member of the WWP. So let's please give them some applause to start things off. I just want to say that we are going to be filming certain segments of this. We're going to be filming our two speakers. And is there any objection to us also recording the Q&A session? If there's anybody that would like us to not record that, we are flexible and that great. So we'll just assume that the whole segment will be recorded. So just keep in mind that this information could get posted on the internet if that's of concern to you. So without further ado, I'd like to cede the floor to our guest and begin with Ms. Rainey. Oh, yes, ma'am.
Can I suggest that we move the podium?
Absolutely.
So that, because you have the bright light behind you.
Go ahead. Thank you for the suggestion. Ms. Rainey, whatever you're ready. Thank you.
I would like to say good afternoon to everyone. It is a pleasure to be here. I would just like to tell a little about myself. I have 30 years of being active in housing and fighting for civil rights. I also have a national background in fighting for civil rights as well. But what a lot of people don't know about me is that I also have a strong environmental approach to looking at neighborhoods and affordable housing. So when you think of me, just think of me in terms of a long-term civil rights that's been active since 1973. And that's been a long, long time. I mean, a long time. I remember the first time I ever was involved in an environmental case that I learned about was about the PCP in Warren County. You see, we have been laying down on the street for a long time. I mean, a long time. So I always like to share some of my environmental background before I start talking about affordable housing. Today, I want to talk about affordable housing. I don't know how much time I have.
Oh, I'm sorry, 30 minutes for each speaker.
Oh, thank you for telling me.
Yes, ma'am.
So what I would like to do is pass this around as part of my speech, okay? First, I want to talk about housing, gentrification, and the analysis of impediment. So the first question I would like to ask, how many of you know what the AI is, or the analysis of impediment? We got a lot of learning to do today.
We're nerds.
Okay, how many of you know what a citizen participation plan is? Now you need to keep your hand up. That's not fair. How many know what a citizen participation plan is? Oh my goodness, we got a lot of stuff we're gonna have to work on today, huh?
This is why we're doing political education.
All right now. So what I want to talk about is gentrification. You know, people always talk about gentrification, and they say to me, well, Octavia, we are just being gentrified. I said, well, let me tell you where gentrification really started from. I'm going to work myself up. Okay, everybody? You must understand that during segregation, we were gentrified. People don't look at it on those terms. And during segregation, banks, they did not make loans into black neighborhoods. Are you with me? You know that's gentrification, don't you? Because you don't make loans. So what happened during the point of gentrification, banks weren't making loans. They continue to work with it now. Banks weren't making loans. What else happened that came about in the 1980s? You had one of the huge issues that dropped into black communities across the United States? What was that? And what else?
The savings alone.
Keep
The
going.
savings when it crashed.
Keep going. And what else happened in the 1980s? Crack cocaine hit every black neighborhood across the United States. What happened when crack cocaine hit black neighborhoods across the state? They were rated as what? Crime infested. Are you with me now? Then what else happened on top of black neighborhoods being rated as crime infected? What else happened?
Property values dropped.
There you go. And what happened? The media perception set in. Are you with me? Gentrification. So when the media perception set in, what happened during that time? A lot of the cities became what? Help me out. A lot of the cities became what? Entitlements. And what was the purpose of entitlements?
To revitalize.
Black neighborhoods. So when you have that on top of no bank loans, crack cocaine hit in the 1980s, think about it. Black men were pushed away from the families and they were put in prison institutions. Not only that, you had one of the biggest felonies that was passed in the 1980s that gave them what? 15 to 20, 25, and 30-year life sentences. All of this is what? Gentrification. So when you look at the things that impacted, before we really begin to talk about it, we must understand that we were already gentrified. And the biggest thing about it is that the banks weren't making loans. And then you have the black community leaders saying, wait a minute, where are the banks at? They are not making loans in these areas. So in the meantime, what happened? The black neighborhoods began, their property values began to what? Decrease because of a stereotype of fear. And remember, when you have a stereotype of fear, it catches on. Because I can remember, I've lived in Southeast Raleigh all my life. So in my younger days, I was very full-figured now. But even that, if you lived on the other side of town, and if a young man was courting a girl who lived in a certain part of Southeast Raleigh, they were considered not to be good enough. That was because of a stereotype. And not only did that stereotype impact individuals, but it impacted housing. It really impacted how you market that area. So when you have a marketing strategy that states you are not good enough, or that's a crime-ridden area, guess what happened? Nobody wanted to make loans. The value of the properties dropped drastically in those areas. And then you have to understand, you're really talking about a marketing strategy. So when that happens to an area, you have two types of economic development. You have the economic development that is positive, and then you have the economic development that is negative. So even if you look at all of the black neighborhoods across the United States, another thing happened. Then you had the issue of malt liquor. That's when your corner stores begin to flip. At one time, corner stores, they were considered grocery stores because that's where African Americans could go and buy everything that they needed. But then they flipped over to be more malt liquor, drug paraphernalia, sexual paraphernalia driven. And what a lot of people don't know, African Americans during slavery did not drink alcohol. Even at the end of slavery, they did not drink alcohol. So when you look at a marketing strategy, all of this was impacted on top of what you already had going on. So we never recovered from segregation, from the banks not lending. We never recovered from that, and we haven't recovered from that yet. I have a background in looking at the Honda data as well. And even if you look at the Honda data of your big banks, what you will find out now is that, yes, they are making loans in the inner city neighborhood, but they are not making loans to African Americans. they're making loans to more of your middle class Caucasian families. So now you have the reverse, that the banks have said, oh yeah, I'm making all these loans, but in reality, those loans have reversed now. And I think this is where you see, I know this is where you have people now talking about gentrification, because for the first time, they can see it, they can feel it, and they can touch it. So this is happening now, and this is where you have people saying, oh, wait a minute, because if you go in census tracts, that is economically challenged. I don't like to say poor, I use the term economically challenged now. So when you enter into those census tracts, and when you ride through the black neighborhoods, that's where you begin to see all of a sudden all these big houses being built. You begin to see apartments that was there, they are gone. Then you see these big, big houses coming. And you ask yourself, well, why in the world are they in an economically challenged census tract building all of these big houses for $300,000, $400,000, $500,000? So you have to look at it, and then you have to ask yourself, well, what banks are making these loans? So now you begin to see the reversal. You begin to hear that term, housing preservation. And everybody needs to question, what is housing preservation? And who are you preserving the houses for? So you have to understand that even when we look at this, everything don't add up anymore. And you have to understand what in the world is going on now with the housing stock, and why have we labeled affordable? And when I talk about affordable, I'm basically talking about 30% of your ability to pay now. Now, if somebody ever tells you 80% is affordable, 80% is $80,000 now.
Right.
I talk about 30%, because I think 30% will give everybody the opportunity for housing. And that is what we're really talking about here, is everybody having a chance. And if we had affordable housing based upon 30% of your ability to pay all over the city of Raleigh, you would have choice housing. We really don't have choice now. We have people telling us where we can live. Because when you look at the equation of mixed income is exactly what it is. You're just mixing the income. And income is not a protected class. So all you're doing is mixing the income. And when you use mixed income, you really receive a smidgen of housing based upon 30% of your ability to pay. I have not seen the one-for-one replacement in Raleigh, Durham, Wake County. So let's be real now. How do you plan to catch up when we do not do a one-for-one replacement? We haven't done a one-for-one replacement in 25 years. So how do we expect to catch up now? And because we have to look at everything that we're doing now is basically mixed income, but we have never caught up from our one-for-one replacement yet. So we really need to begin to look at better equations, get away from the fear, black people can't live with each other, Hispanics can't live with each other. We need to disperse them so that they'll become better people. That's not true. That is not true at all. So we need to first break the fear of what is attached to housing based upon 30% of your ability to pay. And I think that's the biggest thing, is attaching, saying we're not going to do that. Then we have to come back and say, well, what are in the elements what is in the environment that gave us all these fears? First, we got to talk about gun violence. Now, let's be clear on gun violence. You know, we always look at gun violence when it's by blacks, then when it's by Caucasian, or someone we have labeled as a terrorist. But the issue, the bottom line, is how they get access to guns. How are they getting access to guns? And why you may see this in one neighborhood because of the race, and then in another neighborhood when it happened, oh my God, this was a quiet neighborhood. No, it won't. It was already there. It was already there. So I think a lot of times we use racism, and then we take that and we will characterize a neighborhood because of the color of our skin, and we throw all those negativities there. And so when it happens in a black neighborhood, it rises to the top. But when it happens in a white neighborhood, it stays here somewhere and is justified. And their property values don't go anywhere. But we have to understand that when we have all of this in the environment, such as malt liquor, you can buy in certain environments, but you go in other environments, you're not going to find it. You go in certain environments, you find drug paraphernalia. You go in another environment, you're not going to find it. You go in certain neighborhoods, you find what I call sexual paraphernalia. You go in other neighborhoods, you're not going to find it. So the question that I always ask myself is that why do I find all of this in neighborhoods that are economically challenged? The bottom line is that there's a marketing strategy. So if you talk about equal opportunity and trade accessibility, why in some neighborhoods that is economically challenged you find this, but in other neighborhoods you don't find it? And that's a question I really want you guys to think about. Another thing I really want you to think about is that in the United States we have over 1,300 entitlements, and all of those entitlements must do an analysis of impediment. Peter knows that. Every last one of them must do that. All of them must have what I call a citizen participation plan, and that plan tells you how do you give input on how your federal dollars are used for your analysis of impediment to do affordable housing. And a lot of people do not participate in those plans. Those plans are mandatory. Those plans are mandatory. And what HUD states, but now that we have the 45th president, I don't know how long it's going to last. I don't know yet. But what those plans state is those plans state that you must have a plan for affordable housing. You must have a plan. I think the issue is that we don't have enough people who understand the federal piece of this. So I think that's why a lot of people don't participate. You can actually have housing based upon 30% of your ability to pay, but you must participate in your analysis of impediment. You must come out when they have those annual actions. Everyone that's in entitlement, they must have those. It's called an annual action plan. Everyone must have those. And they must state how they plan to provide affordable housing. But not only that, they must talk about the civil rights. Always remember with your analysis of impediment, it's two sides. One is affordable housing and one is that civil rights piece. A lot of people do not participate. I passed around Wake County. For the first time, Wake County, the city of Raleigh, and all the small towns came together to do an analysis of impediment, which means all those towns supposed to have a plan for affordable housing and civil rights. So, and within the plans, they have to talk about transportation, economic development. If you have not received a copy of your city's announcement of your county's AI, for example, in Raleigh, Wake County took the lead this time on the analysis of impediment. Normally, the AI is done by the cities. For the first time, you have all of them under one umbrella. The key is to understand what is that analysis of impediment. What is fair housing choice? So in Raleigh/Wake County and Cary, they have outlined their analysis of impediment. To be honest with you, I disagree with some of it. I really think it's time to redo it. And within Wake County/Raleigh, they have the Raleigh Housing Authority and the Wake County Housing Authority. So when we talk about affordable housing, people will tell you, you need to be at the table. You have to understand the plans that's coming before you. And those plans tell you how the city, the county plan to spend their federal dollars. For example, Cary is an entitlement, but how much affordable housing do you have in Cary? Also, with your analysis of impediment, what you will begin to see is that we have a trade-off between senior housing and multifamily housing, because a lot of people fear that multifamily housing will bring in young black males. As a person with a strong fair housing background, all you have to do is ride around any complex during the high peak time when people are visible. And one of the things you're gonna find missing in brand new apartment complex is black males that age 14, 15, and 16. You'll see the younger ones. Now, if they are the older ones, those are an old project that they were just born in and they just stayed there. But I do think that one of the things that we really need to take a look at is our federal dollars and have a better understanding of how that's being used. And if you don't want your federal dollars being used to do mixed income, the higher end, by your participation, then you can say, look, I want 30% based upon the ability to pay. I think another thing that's important that, for example, Raleigh/Wade, it's Wade County Housing Authority that will allow you to use Section 8 for home ownership. Raleigh does not. And you need to ask yourself why. Because that can be used as a tool for people when they're entering to say this is why it is important that you do get a job, you establish, a work record, because you too can have that dream. But with anything else, it's based upon your ability to pay. So can you go out and buy a $300,000 house? Absolutely not, because that's not what you're bringing home in your paycheck. So I just think it's a fact of being fair and honest. I think another thing that you will not see in the analysis of impediment is credit. You have to understand, some people report your credit, some people don't report your credit, but I do believe in that we need to have more of an equitable, fair system for credit reporting. And we really don't have that yet. With your credit, you have all kinds of consumer protections. In the AI, you won't hear people talking about credit, but I'm a strong believer in one of the ways that we need to look at affordable housing is to go after credit. Credit is just so important. And that is a huge, huge barrier. But we must break the stigma and realize that affordable housing based upon 30% of your ability to pay should not be a bad, dirty word. And as long as we make that, or we assume that it is, it will always be that. And when we look at this issue of affordable housing, I challenge all of you with your school system, when they acquire land for the school, they need to acquire land for affordable housing. Based upon 30% now. We ain't talking about 80% now. We're talking about 30%. I think a second, all of you probably have accounts with a bank. All of you need to go back and pull your bank's CRA. And if you see that your bank is not making those loans in economically challenged areas, or you ask them to say, what is the racial makeup of the loans that you are making? They have to answer those questions, and you can ask for that report. Then if they are not, y'all need to start having a meeting with your bank now. Y'all need to start having a meeting with your bank. Another thing that I always tell people, the banks foreclose on properties all the time. Not one time a year, all the time. That's why it is important that as a part of your analysis of impediment, going to your city and saying, look, these banks are foreclosing on those homes. I want you to purchase those homes and bring it into your affordable. But be clear when you say affordable, 30% everybody. Don't be out there no 80%, because that's $80,000. Nothing wrong with it. But we have a need for people to be housed at 30%. Another thing that I always tell people, not only do the banks foreclose, but guess what? We're selling property at our Wade County Courthouse every day. Every day. So that's another way to bring in affordable housing, is to go after that stock of affordable housing. One of the biggest industries that people work in at minimum wage is the hospitality industry. We need to bring the hospitality industry to the table now, saying you hire economically challenged workers. You need to be our partner now. If you can build it, why can't you live down there? If you're working down there, Why can't you live down there? The hospitality industry is one of the growing industries. Tourism. So we need to bring tourism to the table, the hospitality to the table, and say it's time for a chit chat. Then you have your backup, your faith community. But we need to go after every tool that's in the books. If you do what you always do, you get what you always get. Are you tired of us doing what we always do to get what we always get? Are you? I can't hear you.
I'm tired.
So it is time for a change. I mean, it's time to look at our housing different. And when you look at housing, that's everybody's responsibility. You can't pick on one or two people. That's everybody's responsibility coming to the table saying we must look at housing very differently now. Yes, we are in a different point in time, but we have all kinds of ways to make that happen, but we just can't use what we always did. We're in a different time, a different place, a different point in life. Raleigh, Wake County / Durham now, it's very diverse. So now we need to step it up, and we must find housing. And we also must look at, one day we will all become a lovely, beautiful senior citizen. Am I right? So even when we look at senior housing, we want to make sure that we have that and have it available. We also want to make sure that we have second housing available for people who did make a mistake in their life. But they have corrected that. Because life is strange. We all know where we've been, but we don't know where we're going because each day in our lives will carry a different toll. So people do deserve a second chance. And we must begin to look at people that have felonies so that they can also be, productive citizens. If you don't have housing, you can't make it. You just can't make it. So we need to look at second housing and making sure that we have a heart in our policies for forgiveness. And the homeless population, people with mental illness, we must begin to address those issues differently than what we are addressing those issues now. But housing is very important. I always tell people the key is housing. Housing is your basic quality of life, and everybody needs that. If you have poor health and you don't have housing, your health just goes straight down the tube. If you don't have housing, looking for jobs become impossible because you have to do what? What is your address? Housing is just crucial. And I am a strong supporter of housing based upon 30% of your ability to pay. I'm always clear in what type of housing I'm talking about. And I'm talking about 30%. But we also need to begin to change what is called the AMI, and that is the area median income. Because even when you look at the area median income, that income do not reflect the hospitality industry at all. So we must begin to look at that and look at that very differently from what we have, from what we do now. Housing is just everything. But I would strongly encourage everyone, if you live in a city that has an entitlement, ask for a copy of the analysis of impediment. Am I right, Peter? And that would really get you boosted up, ready to say, oh, this is what I need to be given more input in to make sure that this is being carried out. That is your analysis of impediment. Within that, you have your annual action plan. Any entitlement must do what they call a 5-year annual action plan. And every year, they must hold a hearing about their annual action plan, which is part of their consolidated plan. Even the public housing authorities must do a 5-year annual action plan. Then every year, that plan comes up for review. So I think if you understood the impact of your federal dollars before our 45th president do away with it, then you're going to find out that there's all kinds of avenues to give that kind of input to affordable housing. But again, when I talk about affordable, I'm talking about 30%. I need to be clear. So when you said Octavia was talking, she was truly talking about 30% of your ability to pay. And I do believe that if we could have 30% of our ability to pay scattered everywhere, then people can live everywhere. Not telling me where I can live because you're only doing X amount of affordable in a mixed income project. So don't get fooled by that. The affordable, if you have 294 units that was affordable, and you say, oh, I'm gonna bring it back, but remember, they're not bringing back 294 units of affordable. They're doing what you call a mixed income. And with that mixed income, you have less affordable, which is the 30%. And in a lot of those projects, they would tell you, well, you know what, we want to accept a voucher because it's already low. And that's not true. So please get involved with your city, understand the use of the federal dollars, go to your bank and ask them, what are you doing for affordable housing based upon 30%? Let me look at your Honda data. Are you investing in economically challenged census tract? What type of credit rating are you using? Because remember, you have more power with your bank than what you realize you really do. So not only should you be working with your city, you should be going over to your bank. You guys should be visiting the North Carolina Housing Financing Agency, and you have a right to take it to a national level as well. Everyone should be going to the Banking Commission's meetings. When new banks begin to merge, all of y'all should be giving input into their mergers. You should be asking them, well, where's the money for housing based upon 30% of their ability to pay? So you have all kinds of avenues to really get involved to bring about housing based upon 30% of your ability to pay. Okay? So anything you took from me, Octavia talks about 30% of your ability to pay. That's her talking point, is 30. Any questions for me? Or shall I sit down for Peter?
If you guys do have questions, please keep them in mind. I think we'll save them for a Q&A session.
Okay.
After Mr. Gilbert has a chance to speak. Let's give a round of applause. And before we get started, let me just mention that Ms. Rainey, you have a radio show on the Shaw State, or the St. Augustine
Yes.
station, Wednesdays at 10 a.m.
Oh,
Is that correct?
now I'm straight talk, and if you ever want to talk about housing, you can come and talk to me. I'm straight talk, but now I do the noonday drive.
Okay.
And I also do a column for the Carolina newspaper. And so if you ever have anything you really want to talk to me about, I'm also part of the National Ethnic Media. And one of the things we do there, Peter, we are really looking at housing a lot now. And we're really looking at the issue of you have less affordable, 30% being built. And we need to begin to change that on a national level. We need to begin to change the fear and perception of people who don't look like us. And if too many of us living together, that's a problem. But that's not a problem. That's called choice. And everybody has choice. So I just think if we build housing based upon 30% of your ability to pay all over the triangle, guess what? We can all live all over the triangle. But you just don't have that. And that's an issue when you don't have it spread it out. And another thing, before I sit down, everyone should go back and look at their scatter site policy.
Yes.
And give input on your scatter site.
Thank you, Ms. Rainey. And also, if you happen to live in the central neighborhoods, you guys meet on Tuesdays, the third Tuesday of the month.
Well, we meet the second Tuesday, but I want to
Second.
be clear. I'm not here representing North Central tonight. I'm here talking about 30%. Okay, everybody. So I want to be clear: 30% of the ability to pay. And I also do all kinds of meetings on all kinds of subjects, like gun violence, malt liquor, sexual paraphernalia being sold, in stores, because I think all of that impact your quality of life. and I think that is so important. I've also been active on the national level to make sure with your EBT, such as like, what's that store we have, Food Mark or whatever you call it? That-
Fresh Market or whatever.
Fresh Market. Then they accept EBT. Because I do believe that any store that enters into Raleigh, that's one of my big questions when I call them. Do you accept EBT? And when they tell me no, I go to work. I go to work because I think it's crucial.
Great, thank you.
Thanks. Octavia is tough to follow.
Oh, no.
So my name is Peter Gilbert, and I wear different hats, figuratively, and I'm going to try to figure out exactly how to weave this together. So I grew up about 2 blocks that way. I live in Durham now, and I am both a housing and civil rights lawyer and also an activist and a socialist, and I'm usually talking about one of those things and not the other, and so trying to figure out some of the questions that were sent, how to talk about both and how to weave it together in a way that makes sense is a little bit of a challenge for me, but I'll do my best. Some of y'all are familiar, some of y'all aren't, so I'll just tell you a little bit about myself. I grew up in Raleigh. I live in Durham now. I've lived in Durham for about the last 11 years. I'm a member of Workers' World Party. I joined the party in 2004. I'm also an attorney. I represent tenants facing eviction. I sue landlords who are not providing heat or not living up to the city code. And I also represent communities engaged in bigger fair housing struggles like what Octavia talked about. And so I'll talk a little bit about those things. I used to be at the UNC Center for Civil Rights for 4.5 years. Now I'm working at Legal Aid in North Carolina out of the Durham office. So I think that to the extent that I've got a theme, the thing that sort of ties those things together in my mind is my understanding of the state. And by the state, I don't mean the state of North Carolina. I mean the state in the abstract sense of the government. When I'm thinking about, and I was one of the activists who was arrested for and charged in connection with removing the statue in Durham. So I was asked to talk a little bit about that, and so figuring out how all these things overlap is a challenge. But and why I became a lawyer and what that has to do with activism. So I've been an activist a lot longer than I've been a lawyer. I first started getting active demonstrating against the sanctions on Iraq under the Clinton administration. Here in Raleigh, we had weekly demonstrations. Got more active during the anti-war movement following 9/11, and then became active in the anti-globalization movement, some of the struggles against the World Bank and the IMF, and the big demonstrations in D.C. around 2000, 2001, 2002. And then, I moved back to North Carolina in 2003, started a graduate program at the state. It's what brought me back here. I was spending more time organizing than I was in the lab doing my research, so I dropped out of that, and I've been went to work for the UFCW on the Smithfield campaign, organizing the pork slaughterhouse in Tarboro, North Carolina. It's the largest slaughterhouse in the world. They licensed to kill up to 34,000 hogs a day. Through that, I got involved with the North Carolina Environmental Justice Network, went to law school, and been doing civil rights and housing law ever since then. So it sort of makes sense in my head when I don't think about it too much. I went to law school and became a lawyer not because I had any hope that that's going to fix the system. I don't. I did it mostly because most of the folks that I was surrounding myself with were more talented organizers than I was, and more talented at giving the soapbox talks and knocking on doors and visiting workers. And I naively thought that being a lawyer was a profession that would allow me to make a comfortable salary working less than full time, and I could use my extra time and resources to devote that to movement work and activism. That was naive and delusional. So I now find myself being a lawyer most of the time and rarely getting the chance to kind of do organizing and political work, but I still do a lot of that. So Some of the things that I do, just to kind of piggyback a little bit off of Octavia's talk, when I was at the NC Center for Civil Rights, one of the things that we did was an analysis, a report called The State of Exclusion. The UNC Inclusion Project is the name of the website. It's basically what I did is I looked at every census block in North Carolina that was 75% or more non-white. So I was looking to study the impacts of segregation, not the causes necessarily, which Octavia spoke about many of them. There are some additional causes of housing segregation in North Carolina that are unique to the South and to our history. If you look at a map of where the slaves were concentrated, you'll see the same black belt that still exists today. That's not talked about enough. If you look at when towns were incorporated under Jim Crow, under de jure or legal segregation, many of the towns in North Carolina that were incorporated under legal segregation simply drew the black neighborhoods out of the municipal boundaries. Right? They never included the African American neighborhoods, and so those neighborhoods never got water, they never got sewer, they never got sidewalks, they never got garbage service, and they became targets for things like sewage treatment plants and landfills. So because they were close to the city, they were convenient to the city, but the property values were lower, and they weren't in the tax base of the people who were voting for the city council. So that's where all the landfills get dumped. So in this report, for example, I look at every census block in North Carolina that's 75% or more non-white. I find that those census blocks are more than twice as likely to be located within a mile of a solid waste facility. They're more than twice as likely for their closest elementary school to be a high poverty or a failing school. Look at a number of different data points along the way. One of the reasons why I talk about that is, Octavia talked a lot about the analysis of impediments. What that is, big picture, 1968 Fair Housing Act. That Fair Housing Act was passed following the uprisings and the rebellions following the assassination of Dr. King. It wouldn't have been passed but for those uprisings and rebellions. They had been struggling to pass the Fair Housing Act for a number of years. It had been on the top of the civil rights agenda going all the way back to the 30s. They decided to go after, through the court system, to go after segregated schools through Brown because it seemed like a more obtainable goal, and it was always seen as a step towards going after housing segregation. If you look at the Hamilton, Houston, and Thurgood Marshall and all the stuff that they wrote in the discussions they had, housing desegregation, school desegregation was seen as a step towards housing desegregation, which was seen as the underlying problem. Following those uprisings and rebellions in '68, you got the Fair Housing Act. The Fair Housing Act has been used for most of the last 50 years simply to go after individual landlords who are talking about individual prejudice, right? That's not how racism works, right? That is part of the story, but it's a very small part of the story. The Fair Housing Act, in terms of a policy solution, has some great goals, and ultimately our society is not significantly less segregated than it was in 1968. The main policy goal of the Fair Housing Act was to deal with all of the impacts of housing segregation, many of which Octavia talked about, some of the others I talked about, environmental injustice and everything else. It's had very little effect on that. In fact, if anything, a lot of those impacts are getting worse. Schools are more segregated now than they were when Brown happened in terms of because there were integrated schools in many places in the North prior to Brown, and now many of those schools have fallen apart. So if you include private schools and charter schools and everything in the analysis, schools are now more segregated than they were prior to that. The peak integration on schools was in about the late 80s, early 90s. Following that, after the awful Milliken decision on the Detroit school district, schools have resegregated since then, as they have in Wake County, as they have in Charlotte, as they have in Durham, as they have across North Carolina. So one of the aspects of the Fair Housing Act is that anybody who receives federal money from HUD, so that includes CDBG money, home money, all these grants, has an obligation to affirmatively further fair housing. That means that they have an obligation not just to not discriminate, but they're supposed to affirmatively further the principles of fair housing. So anybody who gets that HUD money is supposed to do that. Raleigh's supposed to do that. Wake County's supposed to do that. Some people get it directly, those entitlement jurisdictions that Octavia talked about. Others get it passed through to the state. And so the state does a comprehensive AI for the whole state. Problem is they haven't done it. For 50 years, they've signed a form saying, yes, we're doing everything we can to further fair housing, and they've done almost nothing.
That's true.
There was a lawsuit brought now about 10 years ago in Westchester County, New York. The Westchester lawsuit basically sued Westchester County and said, you've been lying. You've certified that you are affirmatively furthering fair housing, and all of the subsidized and affordable housing is concentrated in the majority non-white neighborhoods, and none of it is in the wealthy suburbs. For the first time ever, HUD did something about it and said, yeah, and they reached a big settlement. Westchester got a bunch of money to build affordable housing. The new HUD administration has recently backed off that and is no longer monitoring Westchester. But the point is the cities got scared, and they said, oh, shoot, we may actually have to put something behind this signature. There's been a lot of struggle and tens of thousands of hours of lawyers' time billed, and it's work that I believe in, but I don't know that that is ever going to solve the problem. Because, how do I say this? New York City is one of the most progressive cities in the United States, right? They've got rent control, they've got one of the most strictest housing codes, and yet, right, it's the most expensive rent, right? Rent control hasn't stopped gentrification, hasn't slowed it down. Manhattan is whiter now than it's ever been in terms of where people live, and people are being pushed out of the rest of the city as well, right? And this is in the face of progressive city councils and some of the most progressive housing policies on the books that we've been able to dream up and get passed, right? And they've been largely ineffective. The same is true with the Fair Housing Act. It's been largely ineffective, despite all of the struggle and all of the sacrifice to get it. As far as having an impact on the impacts of housing segregation, empirically it just hasn't. So I'm saying all that to say that I believe that the state, the system that is set up, is ultimately a tool of oppression and repression. It can be forced through struggle to enact progressive reforms. Those reforms are always temporary and always inadequate. In Durham, I recently started working on a program called an eviction diversion program. Durham has the highest rate of evictions of any city in North Carolina. There are 1,000 eviction cases filed in Durham a month. Those are the ones that go to court, right? There are 1,000 eviction cases filed each month in Durham. Almost all of them are for non-payment of rent, right? So we've got this wonderful system that we've set up with several different nonprofits and lots of well-meaning lawyers, and we've got the Department of Social Services on board, and we've got the courts on board. And the idea is that we're setting up this diversion program, like a drug court except for evictions, right? We try to get the cases out of the court so it doesn't end up on your credit, so you can find another place to live, hopefully, right? We sit down, we get a little bit of money from Catholic Charities or from DSS. We try to match people up. We try to avoid the court judgment. There's 1,000 of them a month, right? The underlying problem is that people can't pay their rent.
That's right.
Right?
That's right.
There's nothing that this program, however well-meaning and how many hours that I put into it, is going to do to change that, as long as housing is run for profit.
That's right.
As long as there are landlords who are in the business of making money off renting housing, right? We're throwing stones at the wall. I mean, there's no long-term solution or impact, despite smart people working hard to try to fix the problem. If we've got under this existing state system, that's not going anywhere. What's happened in Raleigh isn't going anywhere, right? What's happened in Raleigh is, when I grew up in Raleigh, there was public housing. Public housing is by law 30% of your income, sometimes even less than that, depending upon your income and how it's calculated, right? It was brick and mortar public housing. It was owned by the housing authority. Almost all of that is gone now in Raleigh. We fought for the last 12, were they, from up behind Peace?
Yeah,
Halifax Court.
Tell about that.
So the first thing they do, they come in with Halifax Court, they redevelop into mixed income through Hope 6, which is a federal program. Basically, the federal government has not funded affordable housing in the United States in about 40 years.
Right.
Not in levels that it can be maintained, right? And so what they do is then they offer these programs, you privatize it, you get some of your money back out of it, right? You end up bulldozing Chavis Heights, and you end up bulldozing Highland Terrace, and you end up bulldozing Halifax Court, and we have fewer affordable units with less tenant protections than we had 30 years ago. Now this hasn't happened in the context of the loss of industry or an economic collapse like it's happened in Detroit or Cleveland or a lot of other cities, right? This has happened during 30 years that Raleigh has boomed, 30 years that hundreds of millions in wealth have moved into Raleigh and been generated in Raleigh. And it's been quite an intentional push out, right, of low-wealth African-American communities. Atlanta did it completely intentionally. Atlanta bulldozed all of its public housing, right? Where do those folks go, right? They go out in the county. They go to Nightdale. They go to Windale. They get further and further out where they've got longer and longer rides to fewer and fewer jobs, right? The wealth gap, right, between African Americans and white workers who make the same income is much larger than the income gap. And part of that, a big part of that, has to do with rents and housing. Most of my clients in Durham, who I represent in eviction cases, pay more in rent each month than I pay for my mortgage. Let me say that again.
Say it again.
Most of my clients, to be my client, you've got to be less than 200% of the poverty line. I don't represent anybody who's got more than 187% of poverty. Most of my clients in Durham pay more in rent for their 2-bedroom apartments with mold and sewage problems and everything else than I pay for my mortgage walking distance from downtown for a 2,200 square foot house. I'm building wealth, right? Over the last 10 years, my house has gone from worth $92,000 to worth twice that if you ask the property tax man, right? While those people that I represent who are paying rent to a landlord are losing money month after month after month. Right? They're going in the hole, right? The fundamental nature of the system is that as long as you've got people, whether it's the banks making money off the mortgages or the landlords, talked about the CRA, the Community Reinvestment Act, right? This requires banks to invest in these communities. Their rating means nothing. Wells Fargo has the highest rating. Wells Fargo has the highest rating allowed under the CRA, under the Community Reinvestment Act. And it had that rating at the same time that it was settling an out-of-court lawsuit for tens of millions of dollars for racial discrimination in mortgages, right? The best, and then the CRA was struggled for, right? There was a lot of struggle that went into the CRA. I'm not saying that, I'm not trying to be too negative. I'm not saying that struggle is not worthwhile. That struggle is worthwhile and it's necessary, but it's necessary only in terms of teaching us how to fight, in terms of understanding the nature of the system that we're fighting against, and then coming together to learn how to ultimately fight against that system, right? I mean, I work with a community in Rocky Mount. Rocky Mount is not yet really undergoing gentrification. Rocky Mount is split into 2 counties, Nash County, Edgecombe County. Nash County is whiter and wealthier, Edgecombe County is poorer and higher concentration African American. Right? I represent 14 neighborhoods in downtown area of Rocky Mount who are engaging in this process to submit public comments, right, for their new analysis of fair housing. They used to call it an AI. They've changed the law now. It's the assessment of fair housing. Same thing, right? I don't have any. I have very little hope that Rocky Mount is going to do the right thing with its federal money, right? Because they're not really required to. If you look at where all the subsidized housing is in Rocky Mount, it's all on the Edgecombe County side. It's all where the schools are worse, where the jobs are worse, where the buses are worse, where the sidewalks are broken and the streetlights don't work. That's where all the affordable housing is in Rocky Mount. That's where it all is in Durham. That's where it all is in Raleigh, right? And as those places get wealthier, right, like behind Peace College or over by Ligon, right, they bulldoze it and they tear it out and they push people further away. And as long as we have a system that is set up for profit and to protect private property, that isn't going to change. We can slow it down. We can maybe push the rock up the hill a little bit for a minute, but it's coming right back. I don't know if that's really where I intended to go with this. So that's housing. Durham. The Confederate statue. So I wasn't in Charlottesville, but a lot of my friends were. A lot of friends that I've been in the streets with for a long time. I've been in Yeah, there were DSA members there. I have been to large demonstrations across this country for, 17, 18 years, right? I've been to going back to the DNC in 2000, where we were demonstrating against sweatshops and against the war, the continued sanctions and air raids on Iraq and the Sudan. Miami in 2003. I've seen a lot of violence at demonstrations. I've only ever seen one group that intentionally comes to demonstrations with the intention of bringing violence, and that was the police. That has now changed, right? There are now right-wing fascist groups who are coming to these demonstrations with the intention of bringing violence. And I think that fascism arises when a section of the ruling class no longer believes that the state apparatus is going to be sufficient force to hold left-wing and progressive movements in check. I think that they've miscalculated in this case. I think that the state force is more than effective to hold the workers' movement, left-wing and progressive groups in check. But a wing of the ruling class saw the gains with the Affordable Care Act, with the I think relatively minor reforms gained under the Obama administration as far as domestic policy, the rise of Bernie Sanders and a whole generation of people who were thinking seriously and with less fear for the first time about the concept of socialism. That was seen as a threat. And there's a wing of the ruling class, whenever there is extreme poverty and an economic downturn, that's when both the left can get stronger, but also when racism and nationalism and reactionary politics are going to get stronger. And that's what we're seeing. The statue in Durham was put up at the beginning in the middle of Jim Crow, and at the beginning of the civil rights movement. It was a few years before the Scottsboro Boys, but it was when the first demonstrations against Jim Crow and de jure segregation were taking place. Reconstruction had been done for 30 years, and the statues were not put up at the sites of battles or at the homes of generals, right? They're put up outside courthouses. They're put up outside the institutions of government to send a very clear message, a message that they sent very clearly, which is that these government institutions, right, are institutions of white supremacy. In some ways, that's truth in advertising, right? We don't get that level of honesty from most of our government institutions anymore, right? There is no sign on the Wake County Jail or the Durham County Jail that says this is an institution of white supremacy, right? I don't know that we'd be better off if there were, but that was the clear message that those statues were intended to send and did send for 80 years. If you haven't read Julian Carr's speech from when Silent Sam was erected, Silent Sam is the Confederate monument on UNC Chapel Hill's campus. Julian Carr was the president or chancellor at UNC. He's the man who Carborough is named for. He gives the speech at the dedication of the statue where he talks about how he had just whipped a black woman and the pleasure that he got out of that. That was the same year that the statue was put up in Durham. One of the things that was being chanted in Charlottesville and in Durham when that came down was the cops and the Klan go hand in hand, right? 1979, not quite 30 years ago, in Greensboro, North Carolina, the Ku Klux Klan had been infiltrated by the FBI and the state police. That's documented. That's released, right? The Communist Workers' Party held a demonstration calling for death to the Klan in a black neighborhood in Greensboro. The Klan showed up, the police left, and a number of people were killed. That wasn't 1947, right? That's 79, right? That was in most of our lifetimes. And it was, even though that Klan organization had been infiltrated by the police, it wasn't prevented, it wasn't stopped. In fact, it was incited by the police infiltrators who left prior to the Greensboro massacre. those of us who've demonstrated against the Klan in the past here in Raleigh, I remember a demonstration against the Klan when they were small. There was 13 of them, right? And they've got the state capitol grounds, and there are about 5,000 of us out there to demonstrate against these 13 people in the Klan. Which way do you think the cops were facing?
Right. Us.
Who did they feel safe turning their back on?
Exactly.
And who did they attack?
Us.
Right? The Klan was armed with automatic weapons, right? And the police were circling them all with their back to them, right? To attack us who were all unarmed. Gina, Louisiana. I don't know if you remember the case of the Gina 6. The Klan, shortly after the Gina 6, announced that they were, I'm going to close with this, announced that they were going to march in Gina on Martin Luther King Day. We said that ain't happening. There were about 25 of them, no permit. There were about 10,000 of us, also no permit. Every level of the state apparatus was there, from the county sheriff and the local Gina police up through and including the FBI. Right? Every level of police, at every level, the Louisiana State Police, all the rest of them. What do you think they did? They gave Main Street to the Klan, and they pushed us all off into the back alleys. 10,000 of us, 25 of them, neither side's got a permit. If we think that the impacts that Octavia were talking about and the systems that have and continue to perpetuate structural racism are separate from the state, or even worse, that the state is somehow part of the answer to that, we're not going to get where we need to go. That doesn't mean that we don't come together and struggle for needed reforms. But it means that when we're coming together to struggle for these needed reforms, we need to do it with a clarity of what we're doing and what we're really up against, and an understanding that ultimately these victories are going to get pushed back if we don't have a fundamental transformation of society. Thanks.
I agree with you.
That concludes our speaker section, and if you'd like, we'll give just a few minutes if anybody would like to take a break, get some water, and we can set up for our Q&A session. So if you do have a question, I suppose I will I'll just pick whoever I see first and start with you.
So I have two. I'm going to start with one. I know, like in Raleigh, especially like Halifax, Chavis, and Walnut Terrace, they were replaced with incentivized housing. And part of that incentivized housing required that people show 35 hours per week of work history. Mm-hmm. What I want to know is, how does that apply to women who have unpaid maternity leave? Like, what does that do to their work history? Is there any variability? So if you have 35 hours of work history for 100 weeks and you have 2 weeks with 32, like how strictly is that adhered to?
Well, personally, I think that needs to be looked at, and women need to raise their voice to that, because I know a couple of women who do live in public housing, and they have kids that, have a disability, and they're really working, and they can't work a lot of those 35 hours, because when you have a child who has special needs, you really can't maintain a job a lot. So you have to find someone who's going to work with you and understand. So right now in Raleigh Housing Authority, that needs a lot of attention, because I personally think it's not fair when you're dealing with single mothers who have kids with disabilities. And just because their child has not been classified with that disability, but you're running back and forth to the doctor, and you just can't maintain a job. And it's not that you're lazy, and I really hate that, calling somebody lazy or branding them lazy. But when you love your child, you're going to do whatever it takes to make sure that your child is safe and healthy. And this young lady, she's really working so hard because of her child's disability right now. And there's limited resources. And so so every time they will approach her and say, you got to keep up these hours. And I think that's wrong. And I also think that they should really look at the ADA Act more than what they do. But I think as women, and also as men, we have to stand up and say this is a very unfair policy.
I don't know the specific answer to your question as far as for incentivized housing and maternity leave. I will say that I think that the main problem is there's not enough affordable housing. Right. And it's not that there's not enough housing. Right. There's more empty units in the United States than there are homeless people.
Right.
And even in this neighborhood, right? And I can't imagine that they can sell all these condos. Maybe they can, but the reason they're building these, multi-million-dollar condos is, anyway. The housing authorities are under a lot of pressure to push people out,
Right.
because there's not enough housing, and so they enforce a lot of regulations that. It's one thing for there to be rules and policies in place, but the consequence shouldn't be homelessness.
Exactly.
And so, for example, they have a community service requirement at a lot of them. I've seen people evicted for failure to complete the community service. Even if you have zero income, they have a minimum rent of $50 a month in Durham. I think it's the same, $50 in Raleigh. So you're expected to come up with $50 a month, even if you have zero income.
Exactly.
Right? Now you can get a waiver for that, but you got to ask for it, and the waiver only lasts 3 months, and so you got to ask again in 3 months, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so the fact is that lots of these policies, like working or the community service or anything else, are or the onerous restrictions on drug activity and things like that, are all just designed to keep the turnover up, because they've got Raleigh and Durham have waiting lists that are about 8 years long.
Yes.
To get into public housing in Raleigh or Durham, you can get on the waiting list, and it's only 1 day a year that they even open the waiting list. So to even get on the waiting list, you got to know the day of the year that they'll even put your name on the waiting list to wait 8 years to get an apartment. Maybe, because then they do another screening when the 8 years is up.
Right.
So, I fight against these policies like that all the time. Like that's my job. But it's.
And not only that, when we were dealing with the Forest Hills case in Garner, what we found out was that you have HUD rules,
Right.
but you also have administrative rules, and those can be two different set of rules. Because HUD can set this rule, but your local PHAs, they have authority, administrative authority, and sometimes they can take that administrative authority and stretch it from here to there and make it so strict.
They try to.
Yeah, they try to, but that may not be a HUD rule. For a good example, we had a private owner, and she had a 3-bedroom house, and she said that she would rent to this lady at a 1-bedroom price. The Wake County Housing Authority said that she couldn't. HUD rules said that you can. You following me?
Right.
So we had to go back and forth on a HUD rule, and we finally had to say with legal aid, wait a minute, this is going too far. HUD says you can, but the only thing with that rule, if it's a 3-bedroom house and your voucher's only for one, you only pay the 1 bedroom, not the 3. So we went back and forth, and she almost lost the housing because the owner said, I don't want to be caught up in no headaches. I don't want to feel like, I'm doing something wrong. She almost lost her housing. She wasn't doing anything wrong. And when we called HUD in Greensboro, the Greensboro Section 8 never called me back. I wore her out too. She never called me back. But the point is that it was that administrative rule that they applied that she almost lost her housing, which made no sense. Another example, lady with Section 8 again. Section 8 is supposed to inspect the units. This lady's unit was not inspected, so she called the city on them. The city came out and said, oh my God, you've been living like this in this house? I've never seen for the first time the judge did a renovation. I can't believe it. The judge did a renovation.
I get those a lot.
In Raleigh?
No, in Durham. You don't
Okay,
get them
well,
in
in Raleigh it's different.
Yeah.
The judge did a rent abatement and ruled in her favor and told the lady, you owe her $4,000. That was the first time. And I put that in a frame because I'm keeping that one. But yet, the Wake County Housing Authority was trying to tell her you may lose your voucher. I'm like, no, that ain't true. You didn't do your job. So you were actually paying rent into a home that was not fit to live in. What is wrong with this picture? Something happened. And this always happens on and on. So you know, Peter, I just think that when I look at Raleigh, our evictions are high too. And we need to be doing the same thing. Because no one is paying attention to that. And their rent is higher than their paychecks. And people struggle. So if you want to talk about, you know, mothers not being home with their kids, heck, they're out working a second job, okay?
Right.
Trying to get that rent paid. And I think people need to realize that you have a lot of strong moms. But everybody's really trying to keep a roof over their kids' head. And it's difficult.
Next question, please. Johar?
3 more people.
No, go ahead.
Okay, good. So I'm with Raleigh DSA, so I'm glad to see a lot of people that I've never seen before. And I know that we're not here to have an organizing conversation, but you both have introduced a lot of problems with the way that things are working, and I'm just curious to know, with Raleigh DSA in particular, we haven't actually organized a campaign around anything in particular. We have a lot of projects that are in the works, but looking to 2018 with it being a midterm year, I'm wondering if either of you have any ideas of what we could mobilize around here in Raleigh specifically, if you just have any ideas in terms of a campaign that we can launch, or a particular issue we can publicize and organize people around.
Well, I have one that I'm working I have one that I'm working on. I think it is Senate Bill 35 and House Bill 36, but I get the right bill to you. One of the things that happened in the General Assembly is that the General Assembly passed a bill that took away let me get this right, that actually took away how can you build a house. And they have all this historical language in it. But if you look at this bill actually states that you can build any kind of house you want, anywhere you want to build it, whether or not that house fit the character of the neighborhood. So if you begin to look at this like where I live, they're beginning to build these big houses that actually remind you of the plantation owner's home. And they take these houses now, and if you notice, they are building these houses in economically challenged neighborhoods. So when you ride through the neighborhood, that house stands out. And they build the houses straight up in the air. And all the other houses are really ranch-style houses, just regular ranch-style houses. So you will enter an African-American economically challenged census tract, and there's this big old house. And everything else around it looks like the character. But that house do not look like the character. So when I begin to pull and ask the city, where's this stuff coming from? And they referred me back to, I think it's Senate Bill 35 and House Bill 36. That became law. So you really can't tell them about their design types. So what they did in the language, they used this language about historical neighborhoods. How many black neighborhoods that you know has that historical status to it?
Right.
So that bill actually is a detriment, and I don't think anybody stayed at the General Assembly before they passed it. You can't take one paintbrush and paint everybody the same. So it doesn't matter whether you're living in an all-black neighborhood or all-black, Caucasian neighborhood. Who wants this big old mansion in the middle of their neighborhood, and your house is just a one level? So I'm going to be stepping out and asking for help with that, because I'm planning on asking for that bill to be changed, where you begin to look at protecting the character of existing homes, not just wiping them out. And that's what caused, if it's a rental property, and then if someone approached the owner, they may say, well, I'll just give you $80,000 for your house. Not really thinking, you know what? Let me build my own mansion. So what they do, they really buy them cheap and they build expensive. And when they build expensive, now this is serious. When they build expensive, those houses do not fit the character of the neighborhood. So what happens when you get one, you can easily get another one. And that is what is happening a lot now in the inner city of Southeast Raleigh. So I really want you to think, because Peter made a good point. Southeast Raleigh is bigger than the inner. You have the inner, the middle, the outer. You have the inner that was born out of slavery. Then you have the middle that was passed, that after the Fair Housing Act was approved. Then you have the outer that was brought in from annexation. So each one of them have a different history. But in the inner, those neighborhoods that was born out of slavery, you can now ride through and you'll do this. What in the world? And you say, well, how did this house
And
get
2
here?
blocks away, the road still ain't paved.
Right,
That's
right.
So I would just like to say that is very important, and that is a statewide bill. Now, that's not a local bill.
So, and
It's
that,
statewide.
that bill is part of the general move by the General Assembly to strip authority from cities. So what that bill does is it basically curtails their zoning authority, much like HB2 curtailed their ability to have civil rights protections and employment protections, the bathroom bill, right? Much like the bill that they passed preventing cities and counties from removing these racist monuments.
Right.
This bill is in that larger context of a right-wing General Assembly stripping power consciously from municipalities, which many of which, the larger ones anyway, are more progressive than the legislature as a whole.
Right.
So for me, that is very important, because when you ride through the inner city, that's what you're seeing. And you are seeing that it is huge. And then when they build them, they, in my personal opinion, they give them the flavor of slavery, but they tell you that their houses represent history. But that's a part of history. I don't care if you follow me.
Right.
So I would be asking for help with that, because that's more that will impact neighborhoods across the state, regardless of where you live.
Yeah, thank you.
You're
Did you
welcome.
have anything? But no, that's great. I took all my notes.
I mean, there continues to be a need for Raleigh City Council to do something concrete about affordable housing. There's been a lot of talk and very little concrete action. For example, when they've granted the variances on height, they haven't required affordable housing as a concession. They haven't involved, they could and need to adopt inclusionary zoning, which the developers will tell you is illegal. It is not illegal, right? It is, in fact, the law in Chapel Hill and in Davidson. The city attorneys are risk averse. They will tell you that it's illegal. It is not. So inclusionary zoning basically means that you zone something where you are either mandatory or voluntary, required to include a certain number of units of affordable housing. I'd love to see a struggle waged against the city to adopt mandatory inclusionary zoning. One of our favorite struggles is around the buses. So, as they continue to raise the fares on the CAT buses, there's one bus line in Raleigh that is free, right? The R line, the line that serves Cameron Village and the bars, the only line in Raleigh that is predominantly white and not predominantly poor, right, is the only free bus line in Raleigh. At the same, they are basically subsidizing drunk white kids to get home from the bar, right, on the backs of working people trying to get to work. So they keep raising the rates on all the other, and you know what's interesting is they know it because when they did a ridership survey to determine the demographics of people who are using the CAT bus, they didn't ask on the R line.
Right.
Because they didn't want to know. Because if they'd even done the survey, then we'd have a civil rights complaint, right? We could shut them down under Title VI. But so they didn't do the survey on the R line. But if you just look at the census blocks that it serves, like this one, for example, it becomes very clear who's riding that bus. Also, just one last thing. This is a national struggle, but one of the main demands around Puerto Rico is to cancel the debt. And there are banks in Raleigh, big banks in Raleigh, that hold a lot of the debt on Puerto Rico. And so it would be great to see some actions and demands to cancel the debt on Puerto Rico.
I'm glad you said that because I was going to bring that up too about the banks. You know, I used to work for Peter in Durham, and back then it was called the Community Reinvestment Association, and I was the director across the state of working to educate people on the banks and making sure that they were involved. I just think that it is time for action. I really do now. So thank you.
I had asked Brian to prepare some questions on affordable housing. So would you mind just getting to those?
Yeah, sure. So one of the things that Raleigh DSA was looking into earlier in the year is working with a whole mess of community groups, pulling together a coalition to push for the establishment of a community land trust. Mm-hmm. And for those who are not aware of what a community land trust is, it's essentially a 501c3 nonprofit that essentially permanently takes land off of the private market, holds it and uses it to develop housing that is, the idea at least, is into perpetuity affordable for working class communities. Obviously, there's limits to what you can do with that, but one of the things that, as we went around having kind of conversations with various stakeholders in affordable housing issues here in Wake County, is that there was appetite and support for it, but no one was necessarily willing to sort of pull the trigger and push for it. So I wanted to get y'all's read, because obviously Wake County in the Triangle is the only county that doesn't have a land trust. Durham's got the Durham Community Trust, Orange County's got the Community Home Trust, Land Trust. So I wanted to get y'all's feedback about this, about what do you think the viability of community land trust would be in Wake County?
Well, personally, I think that right now you stand an extra chance because Mr. Larry Jarvis is talking about a land trust now. And so I think now is the time this group really should meet with Mr. Larry Jarvis and say, you know, at this group, and say, you know, we would like to see the city move forward in the creation of a land trust. We think the time is right, and it's now that this is an opportunity to get out of the box and do something different. So I would strongly encourage you calling Mr. Larry Jarvis at 919-996.
Is this real? 919.
919-996-4330, and just tell him that Octavia Rainey said that y'all would like to meet with him to talk about a land trust, and you would like to see one of those land trusts created in East College Park.
Nice.
I think from my perspective on the land trust, it depends upon how you go about it. Mm-hmm. And it needs to be based upon tenant organizing and working with the longtime homeowners of the neighborhoods where you're trying to operate. So a good example of that model is, did you ever run across Nellie Bailey, Harlem Tenants Council? She's incredible, a real firebrand. But the Harlem Tenants Council built a land trust, but it grew out of tenant organizing in Harlem, and now they own a number of apartment buildings in Harlem as sort of a bulwark against gentrification. The history of the Durham Community Land Trust is frankly a little bit rockier. The West End neighborhoods, Tuscaloosa, Lakewood, West End, Moorhead Hill, and Birch Avenue, where the Durham Community Land Trust operates, were historically African American communities with high levels of home ownership. They're now being subject to rapid gentrification. That's right. But when the Durham Community Land Trust came in, it was people who were well-meaning, who wanted to do the right thing, and it has operated in that way, in that there are now a number of homes owned by the Durham Community Land Trust in my neighborhood and other neighborhoods that have been preserved. But it wasn't done with the buy-in from the beginning of the existing neighborhood organizations and the long-time families and landowners who had been there, who had some very real concerns about what a land trust means when you're talking about building wealth and wealth preservation. And for most working people in the United States, most of our wealth is in our homes. That is much more true for the African American community. They're much less likely to have wealth that is in cash assets and stocks and other types of fluid assets, and a greater percentage. So they have a smaller percentage of wealth overall, of course, hugely smaller, but a greater percentage of what wealth they do have is in their homes. And so when you're going into a historically black neighborhood and you're talking about a model of fighting gentrification that undermines building wealth in the land, because the land trust owns the land, maintains ownership of the land, you've got to have those conversations. You've got to figure out what does that mean, and what are we gaining if we're undermining the ability of these families to retain and build wealth based on this land.
Well, let me say this. I live in College Park, so you're talking to the right person. And I just think that we do support a land trust, and we think it is a great opportunity to have affordable home ownership. And so I would highly recommend that you do call in. And that's the first phase of indulging anybody in a conversation. It's about a land trust. Because even when you look at a land trust, you can use that trust in other ways. For example, in Harlem, I did a lot of work in Harlem. And one of the things that they did, they would acquire abandoned apartment complexes. And they would work with their federal dollars. But as a part of the working, they would train the tenants on how to manage their property.
Right.
And see, that's what people need to understand. It goes back to the economics of it. So when you own a piece of the pie, I'm not going to let you come in and just tear it all up. You following me? Because all of us is invested in it. So when you look at Harlem, what I really liked about what they did, they really went in as a demonstration, and I saw when this group bought this one abandoned apartment, but they had to bring the city to the table to help leverage it with their HUD dollars. But a part of this was going in, giving them all the training that they needed, and the city really babysitted that for 5 years before they let it go, so that they were there to help them when they failed or when they cried. They had a large oversight. And so what happened, and when I look at it at that same project to this day, it's up and running, and they are doing excellent with that project. But with anything you do, you have to really work with people and teach people and hold their hands, because it's really a new process. We can do a lot of things different because you have a lot of banks who foreclose on apartments. You have a lot of apartments that sold at the courthouse. So there's all kinds of opportunities to do things differently. And I think sometimes people are afraid to do things differently. But that's why having groups, people coming together and say there's nothing wrong with doing something different now. Because we have to, in order to create housing based upon 30% of your ability to pay. I have lived in College Park all my life. I've never lived anywhere else in Raleigh. So we are really talking about a land trust now, because we have strong concerns about the homes that's being built not being affordable. We have a lot of concerns about that. But we believe that if more voices came to the table and said, we need to do a land trust, we will assure you that we're not going to do a land banking, and the next thing you know, we're going to give it to somebody else and they're going to be building all of these upscale houses. Yes, I do think that there needs to be a different dialogue because of trust factor. But yes, I think there's a lot of support for a land trust, period. And I think that is the right conversation to have. But really, it starts as a conversation. Nothing happens unless you have a conversation anyway.
Exactly.
So you have to have a conversation. And I can guarantee you that there'll be plenty of support even coming from the churches for a land trust.
And I'd spoken to the Montforts at the A. Philip Randolph Institute. They're supportive of the idea. And this is something that we kind of backbenched and we're kind of reapproaching this work now because we've built some more internal capacity. So like that might be something that we talk about offline after this event. I guess the last question that I have specifically about this is the issue of preemption hangs over all of this. Peter talked about HB2. You know, one of the things that I don't know if people are aware of, that during the passage of the anti-trans discrimination ordinances in Charlotte, the city council had state legislators threatening to dissolve their city government, which they can legally do because we don't have home rule in North Carolina. So I guess my question is, touching on what Peter talked about, the essential temporary nature of reforms that are won through the legislature, how much do you think we should prioritize working for reforms on a local level versus trying to fundamentally build and expand sort of local power in the state? And that's to both of y'all.
I think you do them at the same time, right? When the fact that the reforms are temporary and transitory and insufficient doesn't mean that we don't fight for them, because it's how we build organization, right?
Power concedes nothing without a demand.
Right.
Yes, and that's the only, you got to be doing something if you want people to come to your meetings.
Right.
People aren't going to come to 4 meetings of a group that is just meeting, right? And, very few of us, certainly not me, are going to say, now's the time to take to the hills and, start the revolution, right? We're not there yet, right? So what do you do other than just meet all the time or take to the hills, right? Well, you struggle for what you can win now, and through those struggles you learn how to struggle, and you learn how to talk to workers, and you learn how to bring people into an understanding of the nature of this white supremacist, racist system, into an understanding of the role of the state, and that understanding doesn't come just through studying and conversation, right? It comes through practice, right? I mean, I had read State and Revolution a couple of times, but I happened to be rereading it when I was in Miami in 2003 when we were demonstrating against the expansion of NAFTA to cover all of the Americas. They called it the Free Trade Area of the Americas. And, there were 7,000 cops there, and they used 11 different forms of projectiles against us, and they were bragging on CNN about their beanbags and rubber bullets and wooden bullets and blah, blah, whatever all they used against us. And reading about the nature of the state and special bodies of armed men while you're in that struggle, it's got a different impact.
And then to the piggyback off of Peter, I will always say everything that you do is really local. Because anything that you do, you need to feel seeds. Always remember, you have power to voice and voice to power. And that actually comes from organization and mobilization. And everything is always local, and then it goes up. So on a local level, when you empower people, you don't have any problem when you get to the General Assembly, because with the General Assembly, you need to have bodies. And you need to have people really ready to do a rally there, ready to fill those seats. You have to have them motivated. But always remember, anytime people can feel, touch, and see, they'll come out. So the goal is, how do you get to feel, touch, and see? And that's really at a local level where you lead power to voice, and that's power. And so I think that the way to get people more involved is you do start those conversations, but it must be issues that is see, feel, and touch. And when you can see it, you can feel it, you can touch it, it has one of the most personal impact. And you'll have people coming out who may say, I can't come to this meeting, but I can make this meeting because of my job. You'll end up having people taking off work and losing pay with no benefits, because this is how important it is to them. So the thing is see, feel, and touch. And everything is local. I don't care what you do, it always comes to local. And I just think that you have to strike while the time is right. And now that you have all of these issues centered around affordable, which I go back to 30% of the ability to pay. So you have to be clear when you say affordable with me. Because I tell people now, I'm not out here for no 80% now. Well, I need to go back home. I'm not here for 30%. But I do think, always remember, power to voice and voice to power is just so important. And people will come out on issues that they can see, feel, and touch, that impact them.
We do have to leave the space at 4. I believe we have time for one more question. Yes.
Oh, yeah, I have a great last question. You've given us so much wonderful information about how this housing could work. Could you wrap it up so we could say in 10 years, if everything went right and we saw, felt, and touched it, it was 30% affordable, 30%, but what else? What would that housing look like? Is it the individual houses that were that the city bought? Do people rent? Do they go? Is it rent to own? Is it apartment complexes? Is it built new? What does it look like? What's your housing utopia?
Okay, I'll go first, Peter. One of the things I tell people, what I say to churches all the time, number one, God's not making any more land. Any land you get in there, you have to take the policy. Second, we're coming up on the 2020 census now. So when you come up on the 2020 census, what happened during the census that a lot of people don't like to talk about? The redrawing of the line.
Oh, yeah. That's right.
The redrawing of the line. When you look at the 2020 census in a lot of the economically distressed areas, what you're going to find now is that those census tracts are no longer property census tracts.
Absolutely.
So when we begin to look at the future for housing, we must begin to look at how we're going to draw the line. Am I right, Peter? Because they're going to have a lot to do with it. How we're going to draw the line. What type of zoning will we use? Because remember, right now, there is no more land. So the land that you're actually talking about, and I'm going to talk about more the city of Raleigh, what you're really talking about is basically redevelopment land, basically going into more of the county where you have a lot of like trailer parks. You're actually talking about going after the rest of the farmland that available, but they're really not using. You are actually, I mean, people need to understand this. You are actually looking at a lot of your older shopping centers that's probably old, and people need to figure out what they're doing with them. You're going to probably see a different public housing coming up in the future. So a lot of this is going to be shaped about where will we go toward 2025 and 2030. Starting, I think it's going to be in 2025 or 2026, 2027, you're going to see the city starting on their comp plan that'll take you to 2050. Now, a lot of us think it's not going to be here to 2050. But I just think for the land use, I think it's very serious because the land use that we have, we need to rethink of how we use that land now because it's just very, very scarce. Our census tracts, economically, they are going to change because right now, a lot of them, they have these big old houses being built. So for a lot of them, that was affordable when they first acquired it. If you look at 5 years from now or 2 years from now, those houses will probably be $1 million, sitting up on $1 million. So we're going to end up really moving more out into the county. The trailer parks will actually disappear to more upscale. Our shopping centers that are old. Then we have to look at the reuse when people pass on and their kids still have the house and they don't want it. I mean, we have to look at a lot of things that would dictate that different type of land use. What they are predicting for the future that we would need to do density in order to have 30% of the ability to pay. Peter?
It's hard for me to imagine anything happening in the next 5 years except less affordable housing and Raleigh continuing on the trajectory of getting whiter and wealthier.
Yep.
And I think that my vision then for 5 years from now is that we've built a movement that's fighting that. We don't have a movement that's fighting it now. During the Great Depression, during the 1930s, there were neighborhood defense committees that were organized mostly by socialists who would stop the sheriff when the sheriff came and put you out, right? In Michigan, for a long time, since the foreclosure crisis in 2008, McCowie and some other organizations have been working on a moratorium on foreclosures and evictions. During the Depression, a lot of governors used their executive powers to declare a state of emergency and suspend foreclosures and evictions. Evictions can't happen in North Carolina without the state's involvement. Self-help evictions are not allowed as a matter of law. A landlord cannot lock you out unless a judge says so, and then a sheriff enforces it, right? That's the state that's enforcing it. The same happens with foreclosures. They can't put you out unless a court says so, and then a sheriff enforces it, right? What I'd like to see is a mass popular movement calling upon our governor to stop using the state apparatus to push people out of their homes.
And all you do is just send a letter to the governor. Asking for it.
That's one approach.
If you'd like to hear about future events, we have our email address available for you here. If you'd like to hear more from Octavia with the Straight Talk program, the best place to hear your thoughts.
Yes, and my email is Octavia_Rainey@yahoo.com.
And Peter regularly writes for the Workers' World website articles, great articles. And is that the best place to hear your thoughts?
Yeah, if you have specific questions or if you want to get in touch with me, you can get my number or email from Charlie. That'd be fine.
Yeah. If you'd like to ask any questions that we didn't have time for, please just email us and we'll get those where they need to be. Thank you again for coming out. Hope to see you at the next one.